Okay, so adapting to climate change in the Gulf of Maine. To start with, I want to set the stage by going back in time a little bit. The environment has always been changing, and that's sort of a favorite tagline of climate skeptics, actually, or they'll often say the climate has always been changing, it's no big deal. It's actually true, which is what's so troublesome about that sort of tagline, but bear with me. So if you go way back to around the time of when humans started recording history, the Gulf of Maine. Can you guys see that? Maybe we should dim the lights a little bit. Is that a little bit better? All right. Yeah, it's a little bit better. Okay, so if you go back to around 10,000 years ago, this is what the Gulf of Maine looked like. The last ice age was just ending. The ice sheets were retreating. Sea level was much lower. So if you look here is Cape Cod. Here's where the coast of Maine would be today in Nova Scotia. And all of this sort of extending south and east of Cape Cod was above sea level because sea level was much lower. We know this for, among other reasons, fishermen sometimes pull up mastodon tusks in their nets, or that's happened a few times out here on George's Bank, where it's a couple hundred miles offshore now. And so, just thinking about what the Gulf of Maine would have been like at that time, it's almost entirely surrounded by land, so it wouldn't have the tides that we know that are sort of one of the classic characteristics of the Gulf of Maine today. It probably was much fresher, much less saline than typical seawater because of the limited exchange with the open ocean. Basically, just to say that what we think of as sort of maybe a pristine Gulf of Maine, or the way the Gulf of Maine used to be before humans came in or Europeans came in, was still much different than the Gulf of Maine that we recognize today. So fast forward a few thousands of years to when Europeans first did arrive. Here are just a few snippets to give you an idea of what it looked like at the time. John Cabot described cod so thick that a person could walk across their backs. That was actually just off of Newfoundland, but the Gulf of Maine was really similar. If you were to compare the cod catch off of places like Frenchman's Bay, when people were catching cod with dories and hooks and lines, just out of that one town, it exceeds the cod catch from the entire Gulf of Maine today. So it's quite a different ecosystem that we were looking at. And cod, by the way, is one of the main reasons that Europeans settled in New England and North America. Hunters would hunt right whales from shore in small watercraft. Here's a nice quote from Nathaniel Hawthorne. He caught a black spotted trout that was almost a whale. It weighed 18.5 pounds. So that was in Sebago Lake, not quite the Gulf of Maine. But if you look up the average weight of that species in Maine Fish and Wildlife today, it's about 1 pound. So it's not just that the species have changed or have disappeared. Many of them have actually gotten much smaller, mostly because of human interference. And then this is one of my favorites, herring gulls hunted nearly to extinction. And this is more like around the year 1900. It was one of the first conservation efforts of the Audubon Society. So we think of them now as sort of like flying rats in a way. They were almost extinct around a little over 100 years ago. People would hunt them for millinery, for kind of the feathers and the cap that you see there, and people also ate their eggs. So thank goodness we saved the herring gulls so that we still have them to eat all of our bagels. And just a few more sort of snippets along the same lines. This is from a talk given by Bill Leavenworth at a meeting a few years ago. Pilot whales harvested by the thousands annually on Cape Cod. So that's what this picture shows. Diatremous fish numbered in the billions in coastal Maine. Quite a different picture than what we see today. Tuna was a bycatch of the coastal herring fishery. So it's one of the most valuable species that you can catch now. Some of them go for a couple $100,000 in Japan. At least these sort of celebrated first catch tuna do. But back then they were considered a bycatch of the coastal herring fishery. And there were swordfish in Portland Harbor. So if you think about, Portland Harbor is not too different than the shore around Boston. It's hard to imagine that being a good place to catch swordfish today, but it used to be. I love driving across the bridge that connects New Hampshire and Maine and imagining tuna swimming up that river. They used to come in close to shore in big schools like that. And it's just a totally different scene than what we see today. So all this is to say that it's really difficult to define the historical baseline. This is a picture of Portland's waterfront, by the way, at a high tide. The water comes, you know, you're parking in 2 or 3 inches of water during the king tides down on the docks. All this is to say it's really difficult to define the historical baseline. When we think about the conservation ethic and a lot of the things that people try to do in terms of conservation, it's often to return to some ecosystem condition that we think of as the baseline condition or the way things used to be or some pristine, unspoiled state. And this little introduction is basically to say that things have always been changing and there really isn't a sort of unspoiled state. And the way we really need to be thinking is how to live in a changing system. Okay, so that brings us up to modern times. So I said the environment has always been changing, or the climate has always been changing, as the skeptics like to say. The environment now is changing much more rapidly. So really the difference isn't that we're going from a static, pristine state to something that we've messed up. We're going from something that was changing to something that's changing in new and faster ways. So just to give you a little bit of history of this, because I like history, as you can tell, this is from a newspaper from 1912. I think it was from Australia, and they had these little blurbs of science written for the layperson. Coal consumption affecting climate. The furnaces of the world are now burning about 2 billion tons of coal a year. When this is burned, uniting with oxygen, it adds about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere yearly. This tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. The effect may be considerable in a few centuries. When I first saw this, it was kind of flooring. I mean, I know a lot of the science behind the greenhouse effect goes back into the late 1800s and our understanding of physics and black body radiation and so on. But I wasn't aware that actually these ideas were in the popular press over 100 years ago. And it's actually a really good description of what's going on. I mean, they boiled climate change down to 3 or 4 sentences in a really effective way. Some of the estimates are off because probably our economy has grown faster than they might have thought. We're doing things other than just burning coal, but it's not too far off. The attitudes were a little bit different. So here's another one from, I think, the same year or maybe a year later. But what I just want to highlight here is men in generations to come shall enjoy milder breezes and live in sunnier skies. So while it was in the public press, nobody was worried about it. People thought about it as, if anything, a good thing. Okay, so fast forward now to the middle of the 20th century. 1938 was the first paper where climate change was demonstrated to be happening. So the scientists who laid the groundwork understood the processes. They knew that CO2 would have a greenhouse effect, but it took a few decades until people could actually observe that signal in the temperature records of the globe. And this is a paper by Guy Callendar, who is a British-born Canadian scientist, who faced a lot of, I would say when this paper first came out, there was still a lot of debate within the scientific community. We've since moved past that, as I'm sure you all know. If you go to 1965, this idea has come into the US government, in fact, the White House. So here's Lyndon Johnson in 1965. This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through radioactive materials and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. So, so none of this is coming as much of a surprise, or so you would think here 50 years later, that we still struggle with that. In the 1980s, the first climate model started coming out. What you see, and this is a paper by Jim Hansen, the black lines in the back are the predictions under 3 different climate emission scenarios, and then it's sort of orange or red. I'm colorblind, actually. The line overlaid on top is what actually happened. And so this model was produced in the 80s, which is around here. And now you can actually plot what happened and sort of check how well the model did. And you can see the little yellow mark is where we are today, and we're right in the middle. That middle black line, by the way, is the closest of these three scenarios to what the emissions levels that have actually happened. So it's pretty much on target. Climate models have gotten much more sophisticated, of course, and we can now predict things other than just temperature. But it's impressive that even in the 80s, we were able to forecast global temperatures to a pretty good degree. Okay, so there's the history, and that sort of sets the stage for today. And what I want to emphasize about the Gulf of Maine is some places are changing more rapidly than others. And I really want to get this idea across that it's not just the change, but the rapidity of change that matters and is going to wind up driving change in the ecosystems and in the human systems that interact with them. So if you look at ocean sea surface temperatures, here is a map of the rate of change over the past 10 years, over a large part of the global oceans. Anywhere that it's white, there's been no change over the past 10 years. When you get into the yellows and reds, if you can see those, that's faster warming. The red is the fastest. And then the greens and blues show where it's actually cooled a little bit over the last 10 years. And so you can see that the Gulf of Maine stands out right there is where we are as one of the fastest warming parts of the ocean. So to put it into perspective, here is a histogram of all of those warming rates taken from around the world. So it falls in roughly a bell curve. This is, again, looking at just over the past 10 years. So it's not quite long enough to see the kind of the global climate trend, which is why a lot of areas are still cooling. There are lots of up and downs over 10-year periods. But if you think of just the rate of change in that 10-year period, you know, I have some other areas put on here. The Gulf of Mexico, warming slightly. The Beaufort Sea, warming a little more. This is where the Gulf of Maine is. So faster than pretty much, faster in fact than 99.9% of the rest of the ocean. And that's true even if you look back over 100 years in the sort of good sea surface temperature record that we have. You can look at how fast different parts of the ocean have warmed over 10 or 15 or 20-year periods, and you find that the rate of warming we've had in the Gulf of Maine is pretty much unparalleled. So people, oh, and here's this is a climate projection, basically similar sort of map that you just looked at, but looking into the future out around the year 2100. And again, you can see the waters offshore of the northeast U.S. continue to warm faster than the rest of the ocean. And then there's this one area up by Greenland that is warming slower. Okay, so people always ask me why. Why is the Gulf of Maine warming so much? We know the globe is warming. Why is the Gulf of Maine warming so much faster than everywhere else? There's a couple of reasons. One of them has to do with the ocean currents. And I don't know if you can see this animation very well, but here's the Gulf of Maine. Here's the Arctic. And there's this really cold Arctic current that comes down. It's called the Labrador Current. Goes around Newfoundland and eventually comes into the Gulf of Maine. I have it depicted here in arrows that you can probably see a little bit better. The Labrador Current is that black one that comes around. Here's the Gulf of Maine. And at the same time, we have the Gulf Stream coming from the south. So these are two currents. One of them is really cold, like Arctic cold. The other one is really warm, like tropical warm. And they intersect just offshore around the Gulf of Maine, which actually makes our waters a lot more sensitive to changes. Both of these currents are driven by what's called the meridional overturning circulation, which is this big global conveyor belt of ocean currents that's driven initially by the sinking of deep water near the Arctic. So water cools intensely at the Arctic. It becomes more dense and it sinks. And that sort of drives this conveyor belt-like circulation of ocean currents. And what's been happening in the Arctic is with warming and with changes in ocean stratification, the process that drives those currents is changing. And because we have two of the strongest currents in the Atlantic intersecting right near the Gulf of Maine, those currents are affected most strongly by those changes. And so we're seeing actually the Gulf Stream sort of shift a little bit further north, the transport of Arctic water decrease, and that's contributed to the warming. The other thing that contributes to warming are these natural climate oscillations. So have you heard of El Nino? You've probably heard of El Nino. Have you heard of the AMO or the NAO in any of your classes? You might have encountered that. So just like El Nino in the Pacific, there are these oscillations, climate oscillations, all over the globe. We have a few in the Atlantic that really sort of force our climate and our weather and that sort of thing. One of them is called the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. That's the one that I've plotted here. It's this roughly 60-year cycle in ocean temperatures. And on top of that 60-year cycle, you can see it goes up and down. There's all this variability. But overall, it's a 60-year cycle. There's another one called the North Atlantic oscillation, which is an atmospheric index. All of these indices work at different periods or different frequencies, and they all affect the temperature in the Gulf of Maine. So if you take a whole bunch of these, here's just a cartoon version. The Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, the Pacific decadal oscillation, which actually does affect Atlantic waters, the North Atlantic oscillation, they're all working at these different frequencies, and they all affect how warm or cold the Gulf of Maine is. Just the same way El Nino can affect a given year and how warm or cold or rainy or whatever it is that year. So if you take all of these and superimpose them, you'll find at some points they cancel out, where one might be positive and one might be negative. And at other points, they all reinforce each other, which is what I've highlighted all the way over there to the right. And so when they're all working in concert together, it's sort of quasi-random when that's going to occur, because these periods overlap in sort of random ways, and it's rare. But when it happens, they all sort of contribute to the same warming at the same time. And then you add behind that the global warming trend, and it basically tips that whole line upward. And so you have potential for these really high warming periods. And all of those things have been working in concert over the past 10 to 15 years in the Gulf of Maine. So that's the other factor that has contributed to the rapid warming that we've had. This part of the process, because it's oscillatory, some of those indices will go back down and will no longer be contributing to warming. The changes in the currents that I described are, according to our climate models, those are going to continue to happen. So that's why when we look out to the year 2100, we have the Gulf of Maine warming faster than other places. This is what some of the data actually looks like. I just wanted to put it up here so you could see it. This is with the seasonal cycle removed. You can see the 30-year increase in temperature in the Gulf of Maine, and then 10 years. I need to update this plot, but you can see kind of roughly the last 10 years how it's steepened. And that's the slope that has, if you look at over the past roughly 100 years all over the ocean, that we don't really see a parallel to. There are a couple of other spots where we see something similar or maybe even equal to that slope, but they're often in the middle of the ocean or places that we haven't really been monitoring. But it's nearly unparalleled in the rest of the ocean. And what you see at the end of this actually is this really high point up there. That was 2012. In 2012, we had what people were describing as a marine heat wave in the Gulf of Maine. The whole year, it was about 3 degrees C warmer than average from the surface to the bottom. And nothing like that had been described before. And so it was really interesting to the scientific community. And studying an ecosystem like the Gulf of Maine is a big component of that is actually studying people and people's perceptions of the ecosystem. Because no one person understands an ecosystem on their own. It takes a lot of people, and those people could either be people on the water or scientists or a variety of other communities. In this case, after 2012, all of the scientists working around the Gulf of Maine were invited to it's called RARGOM, the Regional Association for Research on the Gulf of Maine, to talk about what happened in 2012. This meeting was in 2013. And there were people from Boston all the way up to Canada who all came together to basically say, this is what we saw in 2012 in our part of the ecosystem, or what we've been studying with this extreme warming. And it was a really interesting conference. You know, often you go to these conferences, people talk about what they've been working on lately, what they're excited about. They don't necessarily tie together over one really interesting phenomenon. But that's what we had in 2013, looking back over the past year. And I'm going to recount a couple of the stories. This slide was from a scientist named Alan Wanamaker, who reconstructs temperature going back a few hundred years by looking at the shells of bivalves for the most part. This was the temperature reconstruction that he showed for the Gulf of Maine going back to the 1600s. You can see it goes up and down quite a bit. Things like volcanoes affect it. And then he put 2012 on the plot here, up in the upper right-hand corner. That's where the temperatures were for that year. And you can see there's nothing going back a few hundred years that really compares to it. And remember, it's not just this one year either. It's this whole sort of 10 to 15-year warming trend that we're seeing now. If you extend that, the years since 2012 have been pretty much in line with that temperature. Okay, and so then after some folks talked about the kind of the physics and the climate, then there was a series of biological talks, or biology talks. And I'll just recount some of those. So one of the big stories in 2012 was lobster. So lobster have an annual migration from offshore to inshore in coastal Maine, which lines up really well with the tourist migration. They sort of both arrive in July, and it's really convenient. Sure, the tourist industry designed it that way. That lobster migration is driven by temperature. So when waters get warm enough, usually the signal is probably in April sometime, they start to migrate inshore. What happened in 2012, that warming happened about 2 months earlier. So if you think about temperature threshold being crossed, when you warm up the whole year, that threshold will be crossed earlier, in this case, about 2 months early. The lobsters started arriving way before the tourists got there. The industry started catching them, and at the same time, all of the processing plants were closed for renovations because normally there's not a big catch that time of year. And it basically caused the price of lobster to collapse that year. Lobsters were sort of just being kept out on docks. You could almost walk out on the boxes. You know, they're keeping them in bins, 3 times the size of the dock of just putting these bins together. And there was just a huge surplus in product. On the other sort of side of that coin, so here's a picture of longfin squid, not a typical denizen of the Gulf of Maine because it's a warmer water species, popped up in high numbers. And actually, a fishery also popped up almost overnight to exploit that species. So there were some boons to the industry. The next one there, so that's a picture of bowhead whales. We often think about when things get warm, we're going to see warm water species, which is largely the case. But in 2012, we had temperatures that were off the charts warm, and we had bowhead whales visiting on 2 accounts. Bowheads are Arctic species. I'm not aware of any record of them as far south as the Gulf of Maine before that year. So nobody really knows why. My hypothesis is that it was also a bit warm in the Arctic, and maybe they were prospecting for a new habitat, but it's just a guess. Since then, if you've been following, they have a cousin species, the northern right whale, which has also been feeling the effects of warming as well. And we've been looking at connections between warming and their major prey in the Gulf of Maine. So I can talk about that more later if people are interested. This is a comb jelly. So in 2012, gelatinous zooplankton started showing up, comb jellies like this, as well as the more classic jellyfish that you're used to seeing. I had a class of Bowdoin students that I took out to do some copepod sampling. For those of you who don't know, copepods are these little crustaceans about the size of tiny grains of rice, or even smaller, and they're the most abundant animal on the planet, probably about 1,000 times more abundant than insects. It's, if you've ever been swimming in the ocean, you've swallowed them. So we were going to go out on this boat, do some sampling, and learn how to identify copepods, which is also a real pain in the neck because they all look exactly the same, and I'm not very good at it. So to my good fortune, there were no copepods in the samples, and I have never been out in the Gulf of Maine, or really anywhere, put a plankton net in the water and not come up with copepods. This was extremely unusual. And instead, what we were pulling up were these fist-sized burrowy comb jellies, sort of like this, but a larger species that actually eats these. And that was the first sign, at least to me, that these gelatinous species were arriving. And since then, we've had some really big boom years of a variety of different gelatinous species. Moon jellyfish and white-crossed jellyfish are two notable ones, also lion's manes. They have showed up in really big numbers. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But what was interesting at this conference is, so the next picture there is, you can't quite see it, it's a puffin chick. And so the talk on puffins, which was done by a guy from Maine Audubon, was really interesting because it started making some ecosystem connections. So the comb jellies arrived in large numbers. Copepods are down. The type of fish that can eat comb jellies is really different from the normal forage fish in coastal Maine. The fish that eat comb jellies are butterfish. They're wider and flatter than the typical small herring or hake that you usually see in coastal Maine. So there are lots of butterfish in the coast, and the puffin adults were bringing those fish back to their chicks to feed them. Because the fish are wider and flatter, the puffin chicks could not swallow them, and there was a big die-off of chicks that year. So some interesting kind of multi-trophic connections as a direct result of the warming. And then the last couple here, this is northern shrimp. It used to be a really popular fishery species in coastal Maine. You could get them for 99 cents a pound many years. The fishery closed in 2013. They're at the southern end of their range in the Gulf of Maine. They need colder waters, and the populations just haven't been able to sustain themselves. It has nothing to do with the levels they were fished at. It's really just a function of the temperature and their thermal bound. And then the last one is the green crab. You might have heard a little bit about this story as well. Green crabs arrived in large numbers with the warming, similar to an earlier warming we had in the 50s, that not quite to this extent, but it brought in green crabs. And they're these sort of coastal engineers. They tend to dig up eelgrass beds, and it has all these cascading effects throughout the food web. I'm running a little bit short on time, so I think I'm going to skip the cod slide. But cod is another part of this. They're really affected by warming, and well, the short version of the story is temperature's not really taken into account in fisheries management, at least not in a change in climate sort of way, and they've misaccounted for some of the mortality in the species, and that mortality correlates really well with temperature. Okay, so one of the lessons from all of this for me is kind of this idea we have in our heads about climate change or environmental change in general. We often see these sorts of plots where you have, here's the year 1900, the year 2000, and then looking out into the future. In this case, it's global temperature. You come up to now, and there might be a few scenarios depending on what we do with emissions. If we're really good, the warming is less. If we're really bad, it's more, and so on. To put this into cartoon form, here we are now. Here's the year 2100. The y-axis is name your climate variable. Maybe it's temperature, maybe it's sea level rise, maybe it's ocean acidification, which I haven't really talked about, but is another important one. Maybe it's storm frequency. And so here we are now, and this is what we worry about, the level that it's going to be in the year 2100 for our children or our grandchildren or so on, our society. What the story really looks like, also in cartoon form, is more like this. So yes, there is this upward trajectory, but there are also all of these ups and downs, the variance, essentially, superimposed on top of that. And I'm saying this is what we should worry about. So as you climb that slope, you're not going to climb gradually. You're going to go up and down with the variance around the trend. And as that trend gets steeper, when you go from a low point to a high point, that's going to be even more sudden, more abrupt, and more drastic change for your ecosystem. And that's exactly what's happened in the Gulf of Maine. We've gone through one of these really rapid changes, driven in large part by the variance around the trend, and it's really turned the ecosystem on its head. Just want to emphasize quickly, it's not only temperature, in the sense that, yes, lots of things are changing, and it's not just temperature, but also this point about its rapid change that's really going to drive adaptation in our human systems and in the natural systems. So just a couple of examples. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of sea level rise. Here's a map of Boston under 2 meters of sea level rise. I found a picture of Harvard. You can't quite see it. I couldn't find one of Tufts. I don't know where you guys sit above sea level. But the point is, the sea level rise doesn't just creep up on you and you can back away slowly. It creeps up slowly. There are tides superimposed on that. But more important, there are these big surges that come in, like Hurricane Katrina or Sandy or so on. And that's really what changes how we respond to the ocean, basically. You know, you can't just sort of increase a couple of inches each year because those storm surges are going to wash you out. You really need to be preparing for these extreme events, or essentially the rapid change, the variance on top of the trend. We've had some other rapid changes in the Gulf of Maine. This just shows roughly a five-fold decline in primary productivity. We don't know actually why this is happening yet. This is sort of a newer result from some of the data we've been collecting at Bigelow Lab. But this is on a log scale. Basically, this is the primary production rate going back from 2002 up to about 2015. And it declines by about 80%, or about a five-fold decline. And then the other one that's been in the news a lot recently is the sort of global ice cover, or Arctic and Antarctic ice cover. And I thought it's pretty interesting to see that, again, this is not it's not a gradual change, or it is a gradual change for a while, but then it hits these sort of rapid change modes. So this is global ice extent over many years. So each line going across is 1 year. These are the seasons from January through to December. There's two peaks because it's global, and the northern hemisphere winter is at an opposite time from the southern hemisphere winter. So you get these two peaks. And if you were to pull out each one of these lines for a year, you'd see that they're gradually getting lower and lower and lower. But then in late 2016, so just over a year ago, there's this divergence, almost like a tipping point or a rapid change. And so suddenly now there's a lot less ice globally than there has been. I couldn't find a good plot with the most recent year put on, but if you were to track the data, it stays pretty much below this curve for the whole year. It might cross briefly at a couple points, and right now, well, it's come down again, and it's wrapped back around, and we're still down around here somewhere. So it seems like the whole thing has shifted to a new cycle. Okay, so what to do about it? So now, just to wrap up, I'm going to give you a couple of areas of research that we're doing at Bigelow in my lab and other people's labs on adapting to rapid change. This is a quote from our former director, Graham Shimield. I'm paraphrasing. He was never actually written this, but he used to say things like this to us all the time. Environmental scientists have become known for finding problems. We need to find solutions. Before I go into the solutions, though, I'm talking about adapting to climate change, and that's not to diminish the importance of mitigating climate change. So the root of the problem, as far as we understand, is CO2 and other greenhouse gases warming the planet, which come from the burning of fossil fuels. And that's an important part of the solution. Reducing the emissions is an important part of the solution. But if we shut off all emissions today, we would still be baked into about 20 or 30 years of warming. So we also need to be thinking about climate adaptation and ways that we can basically deal with the changing environment that's coming down the pike. It's not our children or grandchildren. It's really us dealing with this now. Okay, so a few examples of technologies for adapting to rapid climate change. And I've tried to pull some that are really interesting to me, for one, and also maybe that you haven't heard as much about, because there are a lot of sort of things that you probably have heard about, like building seawalls and other things like that. One of my favorites is ecosystem forecasting. So the way this is often thought about is trying to look out 50 or 100 years. I think we can actually do ecosystem forecasts on the same scale that we do weather forecasts. But if you just take that idea of looking for rapid change, so here are those sort of squiggly lines I showed you earlier. You can use statistical methods. So I'm a math geek. I put an equation here, but luckily it's cut off, so you don't have to read it. You can use equations to figure out what parts of the ocean are most likely to have rapid change, like we've had in the Gulf of Maine. And so I did a quick and dirty analysis and highlighted some of the regions. The Gulf of Alaska is an interesting one. If I were up there, I would be paying close attention to what's happening in the Gulf of Maine, because they're one of the likely places to go through a similar rapid temperature change. If you do analyses around the globe of where these surprising temperature changes occur, most of them, it's more likely to occur in the Arctic, and second to that is the Atlantic subpolar. So again, you can use these sorts of techniques to at least to look, to identify regions where you should be more concerned than others. But what about ecosystem forecasting on faster timescales? So my dream is that when you go to look at the weather forecast, you'll also go and look at the ecosystem forecast. This is one example from a project I ran a few years ago trying to forecast right whales, actually, which all come to the Gulf of Maine to feed. There are about 400 or 400 to 500 left in the world. They all feed in the Gulf of Maine. So here's Massachusetts Bay and Cape Cod Bay. What you're seeing in the animation in the upper left is a model of the main prey of right whales. And it's moving back and forth because of the tides. It's sort of flowing in and out, and then they grow and reproduce throughout the year. You can use those in conjunction with currents and temperature and whale sightings to make forecasts of where whales are likely to be. And this is one example of a forecast we made in Cape Cod Bay. The colored area is where we had forecast whales to be, and then we could send out surveys and see where they actually were, and the dots are where we found them. And so even with something as a sort of a big multicellular species like a right whale with a fair level of intelligence and interesting behavior, we can actually forecast pretty well where they're going to go. This is a big sort of complex modeling project, but there are also easier ways to forecast. This is something that I've gotten into a lot more lately. I have a bunch of forecasting projects now on jellyfish, for one, a few species of jellyfish. I've started forecasting deer ticks because they carry Lyme disease. So you can actually go to my forecast and see this weekend, is it going to be a bad deer tick weekend, and decide if you want to hike or garden based on that. Starting some forecasts for harmful and toxic blooming species for aquaculture. And so what you're seeing here is all of these dots that pop up are citizen sightings of different species. So one of the things that I've found, unlike the weather where you can just put out a weather station, it's really hard to monitor species. But with some of the new mathematics that's been developed, we can use really low quality control data, such as just a person in their backyard saying, oh, I saw a deer tick. Those sightings are actually valuable data now that we can use in our models, and that's one of the main pieces of information that's driving these forecasts. And so this is just kind of giving you a sense of how much data is out there. The ones up there are deer ticks. You can see thousands and thousands of reports, jellyfish, and so on. And this one flickering by is just an example of what the jellyfish forecast looks like. So we'll actually produce a map like this, just like a weather map. There'll be one for Friday, one for Saturday, one for Sunday, and so on. One of the most fun parts about this work is that one of the ways that people report sightings to me is by email. So I'm getting hundreds and hundreds of emails from people who see jellyfish, often with photos of a stick and a blob in the end, and saying, "Look what I found. What's this?" So one woman actually mailed me glossy photos, which was really nice, a really sweet woman. And I get to interact with them over email mostly a fair bit, and I learn other things about the ecosystem. People will say things like, I've been swimming off this dock for every weekend for the last 30 years, and I've never seen X, Y, or Z. Or, I've been fishing since I was a kid. In the 1950s, we saw moon jellies all the time. That's really interesting for me, too. And this goes back to what I was saying. Understanding an ecosystem isn't just about one person making measurements, doing some calculations, and so on. It's really understanding a whole community of people's view of the ecosystem. That's something I don't think is appreciated enough in ecology. So moving on to adaptation number 2, this builds on the role of communities in adapting to change and understanding and monitoring ecosystems. There's this idea called the people's science. And basically the idea behind that is if we're worried about federal funding of research, for example, or some agency protecting us from a harmful or toxic species, what can we do? Well, one of the things that we can do is put science, and particularly monitoring, in the hands of people who are worried about whatever whatever environmental sort of event they're worried about. And so in this case, we're developing a qPCR. We're working with a company who's developed a qPCR technology that plugs into your iPhone. Basically what that does is so a shellfish grower, for example, can go out into the environment, pull up some water, plug this device that this company, Bigelow, has designed into their cell phone, run some assays. The assays are what we're developing at Bigelow, and tell if there's a harmful or toxic species in the water and get early warning. And then where the ecosystem view comes in is if we can link this data together in a similar way that I've linked the data, kind of the citizen reports together, we can start monitoring broadly and actually forecasting the changes that are coming down the pike. So conventionally, dealing with change, it's really hard to go into a no analog situation and forecast or predict these sort of no analog or unexpected events. When you have this sort of rapid monitoring, it gives you the ability to get early warning for things like that. And the last one I'm going to put up here, just because I'm a big fan of it, is kelp aquaculture. Maybe it seems a little bit specific. You can sort of see this. This is a picture from, I think, Korea. There's the shore, and this is all kelp aquaculture, all these little sort of lines that you see. Because a lot of areas in Asia have already figured this out, and they already have to feed billions and billions of people. What I think the beauty of kelp is, and I'm going to sound like a spokesperson for kelp right now, but I'm not. Nobody from Big Kelp is paying me. The beauty of kelp, you never have to worry about drought. Drought is one of the extreme events we're worried about in climate change. You never have to worry about nutrients. We're approaching peak phosphorus, for example. I know that sounds a little bit wonky, but we fertilize our crops a lot. We have to use fossil fuels to fix nitrogen to fertilize our crops. That issue doesn't exist in the ocean. Kelp can provide a sort of quasi-natural barrier for storm surges and things like that. It can draw down CO2, so it in that way can mitigate against ocean acidification, which again I haven't talked a whole lot about, but the more CO2, you may have encountered this in your classes, the more CO2 that's absorbed in the ocean leads to ocean acidification, which can lead to the dissolution of shellfish shells and other things like that. By putting kelp in the water, it actually draws down CO2 locally. It's not a solution globally, but locally it can draw down CO2 and ameliorate the acidification problem. It can provide habitat for fish, and on top of that, it's really good for you. So there are all these reasons why I think in 30 or 50 years or something, we're probably all going to be eating kelp. Anyway, so we're doing some research at Bigelow as well, studying different ways to cryopreserve different parts of the kelp life cycle, how to the amount of CO2 drawdown of different kelp species and things like that. So it's another sort of interesting area of research that I'm just sort of starting to get into, but I wanted to mention it here because I think it's pretty exciting. There are lots more adaptation tools out there. Again, I don't want to de-emphasize the importance of actual greenhouse gas reduction because that is an important part of the equation as well. But we do need to think about adaptation as well because these changes are happening now. What happened in the Gulf of Maine and is happening in the Gulf of Maine is going to happen in other parts of the ocean too. So the lessons that we can learn now are exportable to other parts of the globe. So that's the end of my talk. I have two slides that I want to talk about some opportunities for undergraduates at Bigelow. And I don't know if it would be best to stop and take questions first and then talk about it, or talk about it now? Okay. So we have a range of programs available to undergraduates interested in environmental science, marine science, things like that. The one I'm going to highlight here is our semester program. I came last fall and visited with some faculty here in some different departments, and I met with the off-campus studies office, and it sounds like the credits and so on, the transfers could work out between Bigelow and Tufts. So we run a semester program through Colby College. All of the courses are Colby College credit courses. Students come to the lab. We've been running it for 5 or 6 years, and we've just recently decided to open it up to students from a couple of other schools. So Basically, it's a full semester program. We have 4 courses, 4 course plus lab that we teach throughout the semester. 3 of them are in 1-month block courses. So there's an intro, sort of a high-level intro course with a little bit of programming and some literature review. There's a biological oceanography course and then a biogeochemistry course. And the 4th course is a field course. So it runs the full length of the semester. We run 6 research cruises. The students are collecting and analyzing their own data throughout the semester. They're putting together, and they're also working on, and throughout the semester, they're also working on independent research projects at the same time. So each student is paired with a mentor. The program has a 2-to-1 PhD to student ratio, which really sets our program apart, I think. There's really a lot of one-on-one. The students are working side by side with the scientists in the lab. That's the experience that you get, and really part of the Bigelow family, and so on. And that's sort of the gist of the program. So you have your independent research project, fieldwork in the Gulf of Maine. We have a beautiful new residence building that you stay in. You're learning a range of oceanographic techniques, lab techniques, field techniques. And where are you located? And oh yeah, thank you. So we're located in Boothbay, Maine, which is not too far from here. I just came down this morning. In a beautiful lab that you can sort of see here. Well, I'll just do this last slide. I'll just leave this up here. So these are the topics we cover: climate change, biogeochemistry, microbial oceanography. So we're working with omics tools, things like that. Biotechnology, ecology. There may be an opportunity to do some diving, depending on if we get enough interest in that. We take mostly juniors. We have taken sophomores and seniors before. So if you're a sophomore this year, that would be the most likely time to apply. Some of the prerequisites: 3.0 GPA. You've taken 3 lab science courses, taken some chemistry, biology, and pre-calc, and mainly have a curiosity about how the ocean works. Actually, we've accepted students who haven't met all of these prerequisites before based on the other aspects of their application. We can tell that they're enthusiastic and they have good recommendations. So I'll stop there. I want to mention for the high school, actually, I'll just stop there. If you're in high school, think about this later on. Okay, thank you, everyone.
I know we have time for questions.
Thanks, that was great. I just wanted to say to my students, stick around because Nick's going to have his picture taken with our class. So stay until after the question and answer section. I do have a
once in a lifetime opportunity.
I do have a question for you. What were you doing in 2012 in that year?
I was teaching at Bowdoin that year in a visiting professor position. And that's why I was out with that Bowdoin class.
And we're going to send him a glossy of our class photo.
Nice.
I'll ask the next question. So you mentioned the drop in primary productivity, and you weren't sure what caused it. And my sense from understanding the Humboldt current in El Nino years is anytime you have warm water pushing in, you stop the upwelling, and it really kills the fisheries. So did anybody document a change in upwelling, bringing nutrients to the surface, which would have caught off the plankton that would be fixing carbon and being the base of the food web?
That's a really good question. So we don't have upwelling the same way as on the West Coast because the continental shelf is so wide. So in the West Coast of the U.S., you go out just a little bit offshore and there's a steep drop off in the continental shelf. You might have seen it in Finding Nemo. And the East Coast, the continental shelf is much broader. So the water depth is roughly 200 meters out a couple hundred miles offshore. That was that part of the shore you saw that was up above sea level in the last ice age, and then it drops off. So the upwelling happens much further offshore. But part of that, what you hinted at, probably is happening. So there have been a lot of the record wettest years in terms of rainfall in the Gulf of Maine that have happened over the last decade. And that tends to stratify the surface, so you get this fresher water sitting on the surface, which reduces mixing from deep waters. And that's where a lot of the nutrients can come in. So that is one of the hypotheses that we're looking at.
You mentioned solutions and possible solutions. I was wondering if you've heard of people dumping iron into the ocean to induce like algal blooms, and I was wondering what your take on that was.
Yeah. So there's something called geoengineering, first of all, where you try to do something and basically engineer the globe to either reduce the temperature or reduce CO2 itself. And one of those ideas is called iron fertilization. And the idea behind this is that a lot of the ocean is iron limited, which means there's lots of nutrients, but not very much productivity. And the reason is because life needs iron, and there's really low iron in these parts of the ocean, really vast parts of the ocean. And so the idea behind iron fertilization is that if we could spread just these really trace amounts of iron across the ocean, we could stimulate that primary production. Photosynthesis draws in CO2. Then it becomes bound up in life, basically, enters the food web, and in theory, will sink out of the surface ocean into the deep ocean. And that's where carbon burial occurs over long time periods. So the idea behind iron fertilization, so this discovery the role of iron goes back to kind of the 1980s, I think, late 80s maybe, with a scientist named John Martin, who has this really great quote, "Give me a tanker of iron and I'll give you the next ice age," based on that idea that if you spread enough iron out, CO2 will come down. And you'll note in that quote that we've understood that CO2 and ice ages are linked as well, which is sort of interesting. And so that's what he was basing that on. The idea definitely took hold for a while. There were a series of Iron X experiments in places like the Southern Ocean where groups of oceanographers actually went out and tested this. They would follow a little patch of the ocean. They call it a patch because they kind of move with it as it moves with the currents. Fertilize it with iron, and then monitor what happens to the ecosystem. So one of the things that did happen is indeed it stimulates blooms, phytoplankton blooms that draw down CO2. And one of the things that doesn't happen, at least based on the results of these iron experiments, is that CO2 ultimately sinks out. That's something that I wouldn't say it's necessarily been disproven, but none of these experiments really showed evidence that carbon would eventually sink out. A lot of it is then consumed by grazers and respired again. So CO2 goes back into the water, and you sort of cancel out any effect that you would have had by drawdown. And the other issue with it is that, and this is getting a little bit outside of my area, but there are certain, iron has a lot of different forms in the environment. And the form of iron that you would need is expensive to make and is not as stable as we would like. And so there's additional cost to just making the iron that we would then, you can't just go dumping any kind of iron into the ocean. I still think there's potential to this idea personally, but there's definitely a lot to figure out. The technology is certainly not there, and the understanding is not there yet.
Well, thank you again very much for coming. Let's give Nick a big round of applause.
Thank you, guys. And if anyone is interested in talking about the semester program, I can stick around for a little bit to talk now, or you can email me. I'll just write my email address up here.